The holographic image flickered into existence above the United Galactic Council chambers, a haunting projection of the Zorthan Dominion's commander. His features were sharp and angular, a reflection of his species' precision in everything they did. His emerald eyes glinted with condescension as his resonant voice cut through the room like a blade. "Earth has 10 days," he declared, his tone a mix of disinterest and arrogance. 10 days to surrender your territories and resources or face utter annihilation. The Dominion does not negotiate with primitives. Choose wisely. The projection dissolved, leaving silence in its wake, as if the room itself held its breath. The weight of the declaration settled heavily on Commander Darius Kale's shoulders. Standing at the far end of the room, he clenched his fists, the faint light catching on the worn leather of his gloves. "They see us as insects," he murmured, his voice cold and clipped, "and we've done nothing to prove them wrong." The council chamber, a vast dome of steel and glass, was filled with murmurs of discontent. Representatives from Earth's fractured alliances argued in hurried whispers, their voices rising into a cacophony of fear and frustration. The overhead dome, designed to reflect the stars, now seemed to weigh down on them like a cage. "They'll destroy us before we can mobilize," barked Chancellor Ferris, his face flushed. "We barely have enough fuel for the outer colonies, let alone a defense fleet capable of holding back the Zorthans." Kyle's ice-blue eyes scanned the room. The faces of humanity's leaders bore the same expression: resignation. He straightened, the motion sharp, as he stepped forward. "You've already lost in your minds," he said, his words cutting through the noise like a sharp wind across a barren plain. All eyes turned to him. "We don't have the luxury of doubt," Kale continued, his voice measured but unyielding. "We have 10 days, not to surrender, but to show them what it means to fight for survival. We've faced extinction before, the ice ages, the wars, the plagues. Each time, we adapted, we endured." "Speeches won't stop orbital bombardments," sneered Ferris. Kale turned to him, his gaze unwavering, "and neither will groveling." The room quieted, the weight of Kale's presence drawing attention like a magnet. For a moment there was no sound but the faint rustle of fabric as council members shifted uncomfortably. Kale stepped closer to the central platform, his boots ringing against the polished steel floor. "We have a fleet," he said, his tone deliberate. "The Colossus fleet. Ships designed for situations exactly like this. Massive, armored, and equipped with technology even the Zorthans don't understand. The Resolute Star alone is capable of withstanding planetary sieges." There was a murmur of surprise. "You're talking about prototypes," Ferris countered, though there was a crack in his earlier bravado. Kyle didn't flinch. "Prototypes built for this moment. While you argued over trade routes and territorial claims, there were those of us who prepared for the inevitable." Chancellor Ferris opened his mouth, but Kyle cut him off. "You've all seen the projections," he said, gesturing to the room's central display. The holographic interface lit up, showing a terrifying visual of Earth's orbital defenses, pathetically thin compared to the encroaching Zorthan fleet. "If we don't use every resource available, including the Colossus fleet, then we've already lost." A silence hung in the room, heavy and electric, like the stillness before a storm. "Why should we trust you?" asked another representative, his tone measured but skeptical. Kyle met his gaze, his voice lowering. "Because I'll be the one leading the fleet. If I fail, I won't live to see the fallout of that decision, and neither will you." The words lingered, sharp and unyielding. Kyle didn't wait for their approval. He turned on his heel, his coat sweeping behind him, and strode from the chamber. The doors hissed shut behind him, leaving the council to their indecision. The command deck of the Resolute Star was a cathedral of precision. Displays glowed with quiet intensity, the air alive with the faint hum of electrical systems and the sharp scent of sterilized metal. Crew members moved with purpose, their faces tense but focused. Kale stepped onto the deck, his boots silent against the reinforced alloy flooring. "Report," he said, his voice carrying authority without the need for volume. Enoch Vale, his chief strategist, turned from one of the central consoles. His face was drawn, a map of lines etched by years of experience. The Zorthans are already deploying scouts to the outer colonies. We've tracked 3 vessels near Titan's orbit. They're probing our defenses, Kale said, his tone devoid of surprise. What's the status of the Colossus fleet? Vale hesitated, his jaw tightening. Final diagnostics are underway. The Resolute Star is fully operational, but the Iron Bastion is reporting delays in integrating its cloaking systems. Kyle's jaw set. Tell them they have 12 hours to fix it. If they can't, we deploy without it. And the Council? Vale asked, his voice laced with curiosity. Kale allowed himself a faint smirk, though it didn't reach his eyes. Still debating whether survival is worth the risk. Vale let out a sharp exhale through his nose. Bureaucrats. Kale turned to the vast viewing window at the front of the deck. Beyond it, Earth hung in the void, a fragile sphere of blues and greens encased in the dark. They can argue all they want, he said quietly, but we'll be ready when the Zorthans arrive. In the darkness of space far from Earth's orbit, a single Zorthan scout ship lingered near an asteroid field. Its sleek, predatory design glinted faintly against the distant starlight. Inside, Commander Zircon watched a holographic display of Earth's defenses, his expression one of disdain. Pathetic, he muttered, his voice a low growl. An officer approached, his scales shimmering in the dim light. Their orbital platforms are outdated, but they've deployed several capital ships to Titan's orbit. Desperation, Zircon said dismissively. He turned to the officer, his eyes narrowing. Deploy the first wave. Let's see how long their defiance lasts. The officer hesitated. And if they fight back? Zircon's lips curled into a predator's smile. Then we crush them. Back on the Resolute Star, Kyle stood alone in the ship's observation lounge. The faint hum of the ship's systems was a steady reminder of the task ahead. He stared at Earth, the weight of its survival pressing against his shoulders like an unseen force. In his mind, he replayed the Zorthan commander's words. Primitives. Kale's expression hardened. We'll see how primitive we are when their flagship burns. As he turned to leave, his comm device chirped. Vale's voice came through, sharp and urgent. Kale, we've detected a Zorthan scout near Titan. They've started their approach. Kyle's eyes narrowed, his pulse steady. Sound the alert. Let's show them what Earth can do. The stakes had been set, and there was no room for error. Kale's fight wasn't just for survival. It was for humanity's right to exist among the stars. Alert stations! Commander Darius Kale's voice cut through the deck like the crack of a whip. The overhead lights dimmed, replaced by the pulsing red glow of battle readiness. Screens across the Resolute Star's bridge flared to life, displaying the incoming Zorthan scout vessel as a sleek silhouette weaving through Titan's orbit. The tension was immediate, palpable, as if the ship itself was holding its breath. Crew members moved in a synchronized dance, their motions swift and purposeful. Fingers tapped consoles with sharp precision, and orders were exchanged in clipped tones. Kyle stood at the center, his expression carved from stone. They're testing us, Enoch Vale muttered from his station. His eyes flicked over a tactical display where the Zorthan ship danced like a predator circling its prey. We show weakness now, and they'll know exactly how to crush us. Then let's make it clear, Kale replied, his voice cold as frost. Lieutenant Merrick, status on our forward railguns? A wiry officer at the weapons console turned, his face gleaming with a thin sheen of sweat. Charged and ready, Commander. Just waiting for your mark. Kale's gaze lingered on the display, studying the Zorthan scout's flight pattern. Its movements were deliberate, almost mocking, as if daring the Resolute Star to act. But Kale wasn't one to be baited by arrogance. He had seen too many commanders fall victim to pride. Hold fire, he said. Let them think they're unseen. Enoch, plot an intercept course. The deck quivered faintly beneath their feet as the Resolute Star adjusted its trajectory. Outside the viewing ports, the endless black of space loomed, dotted with pinpricks of distant stars. Titan's pale orange glow bathed the ship in an eerie light, the massive moon's surface scarred by ancient craters. "Commander," Vale said, his voice tinged with caution. "If we move closer, they'll detect us." "Good," Kale replied. "I want them to. Let's see if they're as fast as they think." The Resolute Star surged forward, its reinforced hull cutting through the void with predatory grace. Kale's eyes flicked between the tactical display and the portside view, calculating every second. The Zorthan scout adjusted its trajectory, darting away like a startled animal. "They're running," Merrick observed, his tone a mix of tension and satisfaction. "They know they can't take us head-on." "They're not running," Kale said quietly. His sharp gaze remained fixed on the display, where a second Zorthan signature flickered into view. "They're leading us into a trap." The words landed heavily on the bridge, stealing the breath from the air. For a moment, the only sound was the faint vibration of the ship's systems as power surged to the shields. Vale cursed under his breath. "They're smarter than they look." Kale straightened, his voice calm but unyielding. "Redirect power to forward shields. Merrick, prepare to fire on my command." "Commander," a young ensign called out, his voice strained. "We've got another contact. Correction, 2 more. Closing fast." The tactical display bloomed with additional Zorthan ships, their sleek forms moving in perfect formation. Kale's jaw tightened, but his expression betrayed no fear. He had anticipated this. The Zorthans were creatures of superiority, and superiority bred predictability. "They think we're cornered," Kale said, his tone edged with steel. "Let's remind them why humans are dangerous when cornered." "Marek, target the lead scout. Fire on my mark." The Resolute Star's railguns roared to life, the vibrations rattling through the deck like the growl of an awakening beast. Outside, brilliant streaks of light lanced through the darkness, tearing toward the Zorthan scout. The first volley struck true, ripping through the vessel's shields with brutal efficiency. Debris scattered in a silent explosion, the fragments spinning away like sparks from a dying flame. Kyle didn't wait for the crew's murmurs of approval. "Shift targeting to the left flank. Enoch, plot evasive maneuvers. They'll retaliate any second now." As if on cue, the Zorthan ships returned fire, their plasma cannons spitting emerald bolts of energy. The Resolute Star banked sharply, its reinforced hull absorbing the brunt of the assault. The bridge shuddered under the impact, and the acrid tang of overheated circuits filled the air. "Shields holding at 70%, Vale reported, his tone clipped. "But we can't take too many more hits like that." "We won't have to," Kale replied, his voice steady. "Bring us around. I want all forward batteries focused on their lead ship." The Resolute Star pivoted with surprising agility for its size, its massive frame moving with the grace of a predator. Kale watched as the Zorthan vessels attempted to adjust their formation, their movements precise but slower than anticipated. "They're not used to prey that fights back," he said almost to himself. "Commander, incoming transmission," the communications officer called out. "It's from the Zorthans." Kyle's eyes narrowed. "Put it through." The voice that crackled over the comm was low and guttural, thick with disdain. "Earth Commander, you cannot win this. Surrender your vessel, and perhaps we will spare your crew." Kale let the words hang in the air for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned forward, his tone cutting and deliberate. "Spare your pity for your own crew, because by the time this is over, they'll need it." He cut the transmission before the Zorthan commander could respond. The bridge was silent for a heartbeat, the weight of Kale's words settling over the crew like an unspoken vow. "Marek," Kale said, his voice sharp, "fire everything we have." The Resolute Star's weapons erupted in a symphony of destruction. Railgun slugs and missile payloads streaked across the void, slamming into the Zorthan ships with merciless precision. Explosions lit the darkness like distant supernovae, casting fleeting shadows across the bridge. But the Zorthans weren't done yet. One of their ships broke formation, veering toward the Resolute Star in a suicide run. Its engines burned bright, pushing it faster than Kale had anticipated. "Brace for impact," he shouted. The collision never came. A well-timed shot from the Resolute Star's aft cannons tore through the Zorthan ship's hull, splitting it apart in a blinding explosion. The shock wave rippled across the void, rocking the Resolute Star but leaving it intact. For a moment, the bridge was still. Then a cheer rose from the crew, raw and unrestrained. Kale allowed them that moment of relief, but his mind was already calculating the next move. "Status report," he demanded. Vale glanced at his console, his expression grim. "Shields at 30%. Hull integrity holding, but we've lost one of the forward batteries." Kale nodded. "We did what we needed to. They'll report back to their command, but we've bought ourselves time." Vale frowned. "And when they come back?" Kale's gaze turned to the viewport, where the last remnants of the skirmish drifted into the void. "Then we show them what desperation really looks like." The battle was far from over, but Kale knew this was only the opening act. The Zorthans had underestimated humanity once. They wouldn't make that mistake again. But by the time they realized their error, it would already be too late. The vast hangar of the Resolute Star was alive with motion, a scene of controlled chaos. Sparks flew from welding torches as engineers rushed to repair the damaged railgun batteries. Drones zipped between stations, their arms laden with tools and spare parts. The heavy scent of heated metal and synthetic lubricants clung to the air, mingling with the faint tang of sweat from the workers. The rhythmic clang of boots against steel grated faintly in the background, an unspoken reminder that time was slipping away. Commander Darius Kale stood on an elevated platform overlooking the activity, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. His sharp gaze scanned the hangar, noting every detail with meticulous precision. He could feel the weight of the battle pressing against his temples, a throbbing reminder of how close they had come to disaster. The Zorthan scout fleet was only a prelude, a test of their defenses. Kyle knew the main assault was looming, like a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. Vale appeared at his side, his uniform crisp despite the strain etched across his face. "Diagnostics on the Resolute Star are progressing, but we're running on borrowed time. The Zorthans will have analyzed every move we made in that skirmish." Kale's reply was measured, his voice carrying an edge of grim determination. "They'll think they have us cornered. That's when we'll hit them where they least expect." Vale raised an eyebrow. "You're talking about the Colossus fleet. Are we ready for that yet?" Kale's gaze drifted toward the massive bulk of the Resolute Star, its armored hull gleaming faintly under the hangar lights. The ship was a marvel of human engineering, a fortress in the void, but it was only the beginning. Deep within Earth's orbital facilities, the rest of the Colossus fleet lay dormant, hidden from prying eyes. They were untested, their experimental systems unproven in combat. Yet Kale knew they were humanity's best chance. "Ready or not," Kale said, his tone steely, "it's time to show the galaxy what we've been building." A sudden commotion drew their attention. Across the hangar, two security officers were wrestling a man to the ground. The figure struggled fiercely, his wild movements betraying a desperation that sent a chill down Kale's spine. He signaled to Vale to follow as they descended the platform and approached the scene. "What's going on here?" Kale demanded, his voice cutting through the clamor. One of the officers straightened, his breathing labored. "Caught him trying to sabotage one of the railgun systems, sir. We found tools modified to disable critical components." Kale's sharp gaze fixed on the saboteur, who glared back defiantly. The man's face was unfamiliar, but there was something unsettlingly calm about his expression, as though he had already accepted the consequences of his actions. "Who are you working for?" Kyle asked, his tone cold enough to freeze steel. The saboteur's lips curled into a faint smirk, and for a moment Kyle thought he might remain silent. Then the man spoke, his voice low and laced with venom. "You think you can win this? The Dominion doesn't just conquer. They obliterate. Everything you're fighting for will be ash. Kale leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper, lethal and unwavering. They won't destroy us because they won't see us coming. And you? You're just another pawn in a game you don't understand. The saboteur's smirk faltered, but before Kale could press further, Vale's comm unit chirped. He answered, his brow furrowing as he listened to the urgent report. When he looked up, his expression was grave. Commander, we've just received confirmation. Zorthan forces have dispatched a fleet to intercept the Colossus fleet's staging grounds. They know. Kyle's pulse quickened, though his demeanor remained composed. The trap was already closing. Get this man to interrogation, he ordered, his gaze lingering on the saboteur. We'll deal with him later. The Resolute Star launched from the hangar with a slow, deliberate grace, its massive form breaking free from the confines of Earth's orbit. The starfield stretched endlessly around them, an ocean of black punctuated by points of distant light. Every move the ship made felt deliberate, heavy with purpose. Kyle stood on the bridge, his gaze fixed on the display of the Colossus fleet's staging area. The screen showed the immense vessels that made up humanity's last line of defense. The Iron Bastion, its hull bristling with weapons, loomed like a titan among them. Smaller support ships orbited around it, their sleek forms dwarfed by the enormity of the Flagship. Vale joined him, his voice low. They're magnificent, but are they enough? Kale's expression hardened. They have to be. The tension on the bridge was thick, a current that buzzed beneath every word and movement. Crew members whispered in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward the displays. The Zorthans were out there closing in, and every second felt like a thread being pulled taut. Commander, a young ensign called out, her voice breaking the stillness. We're receiving a transmission from the Iron Bastion. Captain Tyrell is requesting to speak with you. Patch it through, Kyle replied. The face that appeared on the screen was rugged, framed by streaks of silver hair. Captain Elias Tyrell was a veteran, a man whose presence commanded respect without needing to demand it. His voice was firm, though there was an undercurrent of urgency. Kale, the Zorthans know about the fleet. They've dispatched a task force. We're detecting multiple signatures moving toward us at high speed. Kyle nodded, his jaw tightening. Then we have no choice. Activate the Colossus fleet and prepare for immediate engagement. Understood, Tyrell said. But if they've brought reinforcements, they always do. Kale interrupted, his voice sharp. But we'll use it against them. Have the fleet hold position until I give the order. If we time this right, they'll walk straight into our line of fire. Tyrell's image flickered out, leaving the bridge in silence once more. Kale turned to Vale, his expression unreadable. Ready all weapons, and inform the fleet. We're about to make history. As the Colossus fleet powered up, the void filled with an energy that seemed to hum through the very fabric of space. The ship's massive railguns charged with a faint glow, their targeting systems aligning with surgical precision. Kyle felt the weight of the moment settle over him, a mixture of anticipation and dread. This wasn't just a battle. It was a test of everything humanity had built, everything they had fought to protect. Commander, Vale said, his voice tense, the Zorthan fleet is entering sensor range. We're picking up at least 20 ships, 2 capital class. Kale's mind worked rapidly, his thoughts like pieces on a chessboard. The Zorthans had brought overwhelming firepower, as expected, but Kale knew their strength was also their weakness. They were predictable, reliant on brute force, and brute force was useless against a strategy they couldn't see coming. Maintain formation, Kale ordered. Let them think we're waiting for reinforcements. When they close the distance, we'll strike. The bridge fell silent, the crew's focus absolute. Outside, the stars seemed to dim as the Zorthan ships drew closer, their sleek forms cutting through the void like knives. Kyle's pulse remained steady, his expression unreadable. Let them come, he murmured, his voice barely audible. They don't know what's waiting for them. The tension was suffocating, every second stretching into an eternity. The crew watched the displays with wide eyes, the air thick with anticipation. Kyle stood at the center, a still point in the storm, his gaze fixed on the approaching fleet. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment to show the galaxy what humanity was capable of. And as the Zorthans closed in, Kyle allowed himself a single thought, sharp and unyielding. We will endure. The Zorthan fleet emerged from the darkness like a swarm of predatory beasts, their sleek hulls reflecting the faint light of distant stars. Each ship bristled with weaponry, plasma turrets swiveling with a menacing precision. Their formation was sharp, disciplined, and unnervingly efficient, an armada designed to suffocate resistance through sheer power. The Resolute Star's tactical display pulsed with their movements, the screen alive with data that painted an ominous picture. Commander Darius Kale stood at the center of the bridge, his presence unyielding as the tension in the room thickened. The Zorthan fleet was closing the gap with mechanical inevitability, their course locked onto the Colossus fleet's position. Around him, his crew moved with urgent purpose, their voices measured but underscored with unease. Range? Kyle asked, his voice a taut thread cutting through the controlled chaos. Vale, ever precise, tapped at his console. 2 minutes until they're within effective firing distance. They're holding formation, no deviation. Kale's eyes narrowed. They're expecting us to panic. They want us to fire first. Vale glanced at him, his jaw tight. And if we don't? They'll tighten the noose, Kale replied, his tone edged with certainty. But that's what we want. The crew shared uneasy glances, the weight of Kale's strategy sinking into the room. He could feel it, the sharp sting of doubt, the unspoken fear that he was gambling with their lives. But Kale had learned long ago that command meant embracing the storm, not retreating from it. Send the signal to the fleet, he ordered. Hold position. No one fires until I give the command. The minutes stretched into an eternity, every second a jagged stone grinding against the crew's nerves. Outside the viewport, the Zorthon ships grew larger, their sleek silhouettes cutting through the void with predatory grace. The Resolute Star stood motionless, its systems running cold, a fortress awaiting its test. Vale broke the silence. They're deploying fighters. Kale stepped closer to the display, his sharp gaze tracing the movement of the enemy's smaller vessels. The fighters spread out like a net, their formation designed to probe for weaknesses, to find the chink in the Colossus fleet's armor. They're trying to force our hand, Kale murmured. Don't let them. The fighters closed the distance swiftly, their engines burning bright as they swarmed toward the Colossus fleet. Kale felt the tension on the bridge spike, a current that pressed against his senses like static electricity. He could hear the faint hum of machinery, the sharp beeps of the targeting systems locking onto their marks, the muffled rustle of uniforms as crew members shifted in their seats. Sir, if we don't act, they'll breach our perimeter, Merrick said, his voice tight with urgency. Kyle turned to him, his expression unyielding. They want us to overcommit. Stay the course. The fighters were close now, close enough that Kale could make out the faint shimmer of their plasma shields on the tactical display. He watched as the first squadron darted toward the Iron Bastion, their plasma cannons spitting bolts of green energy. The Iron Bastion's shields flared in response, a radiant burst of energy that illuminated the darkness for a fleeting moment. They've got to be testing us, Vale said under his breath. This can't be their main assault. It's not, Kale agreed. It's a feint. They're gathering data, looking for a way to break us. His voice dropped, a cold edge slicing through the tension. But they won't find one. The Zorthan fighters continued their assault, their cannons hammering against the Colossus fleet's shields. The display lit up with impacts, each one a reminder of the precarious line they were walking. The Resolute Star remained silent, its weapons locked, its crew watching with bated breath. Hold steady, Kale said, his voice firm. They're not expecting us to wait this long. It'll throw off their timing. And then it happened. A subtle shift in the Zorthan fleet's formation, a flicker of movement that betrayed their true intent. Kale's eyes sharpened, his mind racing as he processed the data. "They're moving to flank us," he said, his voice snapping like a whip. "They think we're distracted by the fighters." Vale's hands flew across his console. "Confirmed. Their left flank is repositioning. It's a classic pincer maneuver." Kale's lips curled into a faint smirk. "Classic, but predictable." He turned to Merrick. "Bring our forward batteries online, target their flanking vessels, and prepare to execute Maneuver Omega on my mark." The bridge erupted into motion, the tension transforming into a crackling energy as the crew scrambled to execute Kale's orders. On the display, the Resolute Star's railguns came to life, their targeting systems locking onto the Zorthan ships moving into position. Kale waited, his gaze fixed on the display, his pulse steady. Timing was everything. Too soon, and the Zorthans would adapt. Too late, and the Colossus fleet would be exposed. "Fire," he commanded, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. The Resolute Star's railguns unleashed a storm of destruction, their slugs tearing through the void with devastating precision. The first Zorthan ship in the flank disintegrated in a fiery explosion, its debris scattering like ash in a gale. The second ship faltered, its shields collapsing under the onslaught, before a final slug ripped through its hull. The trap was sprung. The Zorthans' formation wavered, their disciplined precision breaking under the unexpected assault. Kyle seized the moment. "Merrick, execute Maneuver Omega. Now." The Resolute Star surged forward, its massive frame cutting through the Zorthan ranks like a spear. The Colossus fleet followed, their weapons blazing as they tore into the disoriented enemy. The void was alive with energy, a cacophony of light and destruction that painted the darkness in fiery hues. Kale's voice rang out across the bridge. "Focus fire on their capital ships, take out their command structure." The Resolute Star's railguns roared again, their slugs slamming into the nearest Zorthan capital ship. The vessel shuddered under the impact, its shields flickering before collapsing entirely. A final volley struck its reactor core, and the ship erupted in a blinding explosion that sent shockwaves rippling through the void. The bridge fell silent for a heartbeat, the crew staring at the display in awe. Kyle didn't allow the moment to linger. "Status report," he demanded. Vale's voice was steady, though his eyes were sharp with focus. "Their formation is collapsing. They're trying to regroup, but their losses are significant." Kyle nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good. Press the advantage, but don't overextend. This isn't the end." As the Colossus fleet advanced, the Zorthans began to retreat, their once imposing armada reduced to scattered fragments. Kyle watched them go, his mind already turning to the next phase of the battle. He knew this was only the beginning, the first crack in the Dominion's armor. But as the Resolute Star loomed over the battlefield, Kyle couldn't shake the feeling that the real fight was still ahead. The bridge of the Resolute Star was bathed in the cold glow of tactical displays, the flickering holograms casting restless shadows across the faces of the crew. Every screen was alive with data, trajectories of retreating Zorthan vessels, heat signatures of their wounded fleet, and the angular outlines of looming asteroid fields that stretched like a skeletal maze ahead. Commander Darius Kale stood motionless at the center of it all, his focus razor-sharp. His silence was the quiet before a predator's leap, and it set every nerve on edge. Enoch Vale leaned against the edge of his console, his voice cutting through the tense air like a serrated blade. "They'll regroup. They always do. Zorthans don't retreat without a plan." Kale's eyes remained on the tactical display. "Neither do we," he said evenly, his voice like steel tempered in fire. He tapped a holographic control, zooming in on the asteroid field ahead. "We use this." Vale frowned, tracing the jagged contours of the map with his eyes. "You're proposing we fight in there? That's a death trap. Limited maneuverability, unstable debris, one misstep, and we're done." "Exactly," Kyle said, his voice dropping into a near growl. "It's the last place they'll expect us to strike, They'll assume we're retreating to Earth to regroup. Instead, we bait them into the field and take them apart. Vale straightened, his brows furrowing. And if they don't follow? Cale turned to him, his icy gaze unwavering. They will. The Zorthans don't see us as equals. To them, we're prey. They'll chase us until there's nothing left but ashes. That arrogance is our weapon. A low murmur passed through the bridge, a mix of unease and reluctant agreement. Kyle could feel the tension coiling in the air, the weight of the decision pressing against the crew like a storm front. Get Tyrell on the line, Kyle ordered. The Iron Bastion will spearhead the operation. Minutes later, the grizzled face of Captain Elias Tyrell appeared on the main screen. The lines etched into his skin told stories of battles fought and lives lost, and his eyes, though tired, burned with a quiet defiance. Darius, Tyrell said, his gravelly voice steady. You're asking us to walk into a minefield blind. What's your angle? Cale stepped forward, his presence filling the room. We're not walking blind. We're leading them into a controlled kill zone. The asteroid field's density will limit their capital ship's movement, forcing them into tighter formations. That makes their weaknesses predictable. Tyrell stroked his beard thoughtfully. Predictable doesn't mean manageable. One stray impact in there and we could lose an entire ship. Cale nodded, acknowledging the risk. That's why the Iron Bastion takes point. Its hull is reinforced for impacts, and its EMP arrays can destabilize any debris that comes too close. You'll clear a path for the fleet. And when the Zorthans close in? Tyrell asked. Cale's expression hardened. That's when we spring the trap. The asteroid field's gravitational pockets will mask the Colossus fleet's positioning. By the time they realize we're not retreating, we'll have them surrounded. Tyrell's lips twitched into a grim smile. Bold. Reckless. I like it. Then let's make it happen, Cale said. I'll take the Resolute Star to their rear flank once they're in position. The rest of the fleet will engage from the front. Hours later, the Colossus fleet began its slow advance into the asteroid field. The vast expanse of rock and ice loomed ahead, the massive asteroids casting elongated shadows that danced across the ship's hulls. On board the Resolute Star, the bridge was a hive of focused activity. The faint hiss of oxygen recyclers blended with the rhythmic tapping of consoles, a mechanical heartbeat that underscored the crew's determination. Cale studied the approaching field, the shifting asteroids reminding him of 1,000 blades turning in an endless ballet. The tactical display mapped the labyrinthine expanse, highlighting potential choke points and gravitational anomalies. Keep us steady, Kyle said, his voice a low command. We don't want to alert them to anything unusual. Merrick, his hands flying over the navigation controls, nodded without looking up. Adjusting trajectory to match the field's movement. Minor deviations, but we'll maintain the corridor. Vale approached, his expression grim. Tyrell's reporting initial debris interference. Nothing they can't handle yet, but it's slowing them down. Cale's jaw tightened. We need them in position before the Zorthans arrive. Tell him to increase EMP bursts if necessary. Vale hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding and stepping away. Cale's eyes flicked to the main viewport, where the asteroid field loomed closer. The shadows seemed alive, moving with a slow, predatory grace, as if the void itself was conspiring against them. Commander, a voice called from the comm station. Zorthan signatures detected, closing fast. The bridge fell silent. Kyle straightened, his expression sharpening. Show me. The tactical display lit up with the unmistakable forms of Zorthan vessels, their sleek outlines stark against the void. They were moving with deliberate precision, their formation tightening as they approached the asteroid field. They've taken the bait, Vale said, his voice tinged with both relief and apprehension. Kyle's gaze remained fixed on the display. Not yet. They're testing us, waiting to see if we panic. They're launching probes, Marek interjected. Small vessels, likely mapping the field for safe entry points. Kyle's lips pressed into a thin line. Let them. They'll only see what we want them to. The Resolute Star continued its slow advance, weaving carefully between the shifting asteroids. Each movement was calculated, every adjustment precise. The crew's tension was a tangible force, pressing against their shoulders like an unseen weight. On the Zoran flagship, Commander Zoran observed the asteroid field with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. The holographic display before him pulsed with data, the mapped trajectories of the human fleet appearing as faint blips against the chaotic backdrop of the field. They're retreating into chaos, Zoran said, his voice low and gravelly. Desperation makes for poor tactics. An officer at his side inclined his head. Their fleet appears disorganized. Perhaps they intend to regroup on the other side of the field. Zoran's eyes narrowed. Or perhaps they think the field will mask their movements. Send the order. Deploy fighters to flush them out. Back on the Resolute Star, Kyle watched as the Zoran fighters entered the field, their engines flaring bright against the darkness. The smaller ships darted between asteroids with alarming agility, their movements swift and deliberate. They're probing the field, Vale said, his tone tight. If they get too close, they'll spot the fleet. Kyle's expression was unreadable, his mind working like a finely tuned machine. Marek, fire a low-yield railgun burst. Make it look like we're panicking. Marek hesitated for the briefest moment before executing the order. The Resolute Star's railguns discharged a single shot, the projectile streaking into the void and detonating harmlessly against a distant asteroid. The Zoran fighters responded immediately, their formation tightening as they surged toward the perceived threat. Good, Kyle murmured. Draw them in. The bridge was electric with tension, every second a razor's edge. Kyle's gaze flicked to the tactical display where the Zoran fleet was beginning its cautious advance into the field. His plan was working, but the margin for error was razor thin. Vale, Kyle said, his voice low and deliberate. Prepare the fleet for full engagement. Once they're deep enough, we hit them with everything we've got. Vale nodded, his expression grim but resolute. Understood. Kyle's eyes remained fixed on the display. The Zorans were moving deeper into the field, their formation tightening as they navigated the chaotic terrain. They were walking straight into the trap. The trap was set, but Kyle couldn't shake the feeling that the Zorans had a plan of their own. For now, he focused on the task at hand. The real battle was about to begin. The asteroid field swallowed the Zoran fleet, its jagged masses twisting the light from distant stars into eerie shadows that danced across the sleek alien hulls. On the tactical display aboard the Resolute Star, the enemy's movements were deliberate yet cautious, their formation tightening as they navigated the labyrinth. They were deep now, threading themselves into the needle's eye of Kale's carefully constructed trap. Commander Darius Kale stood motionless at the center of the bridge, his eyes fixed on the display. The tension in the room crackled like an exposed wire, but his expression betrayed nothing. He had learned long ago that fear was a virus. It spread silently through a crew, infecting resolve. Instead, he projected an unshakable calm, the kind that demanded faith. Vale approached, his voice low and taut. They're advancing slower than expected. Their fighters are still probing ahead. They're being careful, Kale replied, his tone measured. Good. It means they're unsure. Vale hesitated. Careful doesn't mean complacent. What if they sense the trap? Kale's gaze didn't waver. They already have. They're too proud to retreat, so they'll push forward anyway. That's what makes them predictable. On the display, the Zoran flagship loomed like a shark among minnows, its bulk casting long shadows across the smaller vessels around it. Kyle studied it closely, his mind whirring like a finely tuned machine. The flagship was the key. Destroy it, and the Zoran fleet would fracture. Marek? Kale called without turning. Status on the Iron Bastion? The weapons officer responded immediately, his voice clipped and precise. Positioning complete. They're holding in the central corridor waiting for your order. Kyle nodded. Good. Send the signal. All units maintain current positions. Wait for my mark. The bridge quieted again, save for the faint murmurs of crew members at their stations. Outside the viewport, the asteroid field loomed like a living entity, its massive rocks shifting slowly under the pull of invisible forces. The silence wasn't empty. It was alive with tension. Every second, a coiled spring ready to snap. On the Zoran flagship, Commander Zoran stood before a sprawling display of the asteroid field. His clawed hands rested lightly on the edge of the console, his sharp eyes scanning the data with surgical precision. Around him, his officers worked with quiet efficiency, their movements a reflection of the rigid discipline that defined the Dominion. They're retreating deeper into the field, one officer reported, his voice steady. Their movements suggest disorganization, likely an attempt to regroup. Zoran's lips curved into a faint sneer. Or an attempt to delay the inevitable. The officer hesitated. It's possible they're attempting to lure us into an ambush. Possible but unlikely, Zoran said, his tone dismissive. They lack the coordination for such a maneuver. This field will be their tomb, whether they know it or not. Still, there was a flicker of unease in Zoran's expression, a shadow of doubt that he quickly buried. He turned to another officer. Deploy additional scouts. Ensure there are no surprises. The officer bowed slightly and moved to carry out the order. Zoran watched the display for a moment longer, his gaze narrowing. The asteroid field was a chaotic environment, its gravitational anomalies capable of disrupting even the most advanced systems. Yet the humans had chosen to retreat here, and that choice gnawed at him like an itch he couldn't reach. Back on the Resolute Star, the tension had reached a breaking point. The bridge felt suffocating, every breath heavy with anticipation. Kyle's eyes flicked to the display as the Zoran fleet pressed deeper, their movements careful but relentless. The trap was set, the pieces in place. All that remained was the moment to strike. Vale, Kyle said quietly, his voice a scalpel cutting through the air. Is the fleet ready? Vale nodded, his expression taut. All units in position. Iron Bastion reports full readiness. Kale's gaze lingered on the display for a heartbeat longer before he spoke. Give the order. Engage. The Iron Bastion fired first, its railguns unleashing a storm of kinetic fury. The projectiles tore through the void, their velocity turning them into unstoppable spears of destruction. The first Zoran frigate in the corridor disintegrated on impact, its shattered remains spinning away into the darkness. The rest of the Colossus fleet followed suit, their weapons lighting up the asteroid field in a symphony of destruction. The Zoran ships scrambled to respond, their formation breaking as they maneuvered to avoid the incoming fire. Plasma bolts erupted from their turrets, streaking through the chaos in desperate retaliation. On the bridge of the Resolute Star, Kale watched the battle unfold with a sharp intensity. The tactical display was a riot of motion, the orderly lines of the Zoran fleet dissolving into a chaotic melee. This was where the Zorans faltered. They thrived on precision, on order. In chaos, they were vulnerable. Focus fire on their flagship, Kale ordered. We need to break their command structure. The Resolute Star surged forward, its weapons blazing as it closed the distance to the Zoran flagship. The enemy vessel returned fire, its plasma cannons spitting streams of green energy that splashed against the Resolute Star's shields. The impact reverberated through the ship, a deep vibration that rattled the deck plates. Shields at 60%. Vale reported, his voice steady despite the chaos. Hold course, Kale said. We're not stopping. The flagship loomed larger with every passing second, its turrets swiveling to target the approaching Colossus fleet. Kale could see the faint shimmer of its energy shields, a near-impenetrable barrier that protected its reinforced hull. But even the strongest shields had limits. Merrick, target their shield emitters, Kale commanded. Concentrate all firepower. The Resolute Star's railguns roared again, their projectiles slamming into the Zoran flagship's shields with relentless force. The barrier flickered, wavering under the sustained assault. Kale's jaw tightened as he watched, willing the shield to break. "Sir, their fighters are swarming," Vale warned. "They're trying to disrupt our formation." "Dispatch drone units to intercept," Kale replied. "Keep them off our backs." The drones launched from the Resolute Star's underbelly, sleek and agile as they darted toward the approaching fighters. The battle was a maelstrom of light and motion, a deadly ballet where every second counted. On the Zorthan flagship, Zircon's calm had begun to fracture. The humans' tactics were relentless, their coordination far greater than he had anticipated. He watched as his fleet faltered, their once imposing formation now a scattering of desperate vessels. "Redirect power to the shields," he barked, his voice sharp with urgency. "Focus all fire on their lead ship." The flagship's weapons turned on the Resolute Star, unleashing a concentrated volley of plasma bolts. The energy slammed into the human vessel, its shields flaring with each impact. On board, the crew braced themselves against the shuddering deck, their faces set with grim determination. "Shields at 40%, Vale called out. "Keep firing," Kale said, his voice a steady anchor in the storm. "We're not done yet." The Zorthan flagship's shields began to falter, the shimmering barrier breaking apart under the relentless assault. Kale's eyes narrowed, his focus unyielding. "Now," he said, his voice low but commanding. "All units, fire at will." The Colossus fleet unleashed its full might, a storm of railgun slugs and missile salvos that tore through the flagship's defenses. The final projectile struck the vessel's reactor core, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then the explosion came, a blinding burst of light that consumed the flagship in a cataclysmic wave. The shockwave rippled through the field, scattering debris and sending the remaining Zorthan ships into disarray. The battle was turning, but Kale knew this was only the beginning. The Dominion wouldn't fall so easily. Not yet. The explosion of the Zorthan flagship rippled through the asteroid field, illuminating the void with a brilliance that cast jagged shadows on the shattered remains of the enemy fleet. The tactical display aboard the Resolute Star pulsed with new data, the disarray of the Zorthans now evident. Their once cohesive formation had fractured, their smaller vessels darting erratically, searching for order amid the chaos. Commander Darius Kale stepped away from the display, his gaze cutting through the tense air of the bridge. The faint vibration of the recent battle still lingered beneath his boots, a visceral reminder of the risk they had taken. He turned to Vale, whose fingers moved rapidly over his console, eyes scanning streams of tactical information. "Report," Kale said, his voice sharp yet calm. Vale's reply came swiftly, his tone clipped. "The flagship's destruction has sent their fleet into retreat patterns, but their capital ships are holding back. They're regrouping, likely preparing for a final push." Kale's jaw tightened. "That means they'll concentrate their remaining firepower. They'll hit us harder than before." "They'll target Earth next," Marek interjected from the weapons console. "If they break past us." "They won't," Kale interrupted, his words cutting through the growing tension. His gaze settled on the tactical display, the scattered Zorthan signatures slowly consolidating. "This is our chance to end it. We won't get another." Kyle motioned for Vale to join him at the central console. The holographic map of the asteroid field hovered between them, the glowing shapes of the Colossus fleet positioned strategically within the labyrinthine terrain. He tapped several markers, illuminating potential choke points. "They'll expect us to hold this position," Kale began, his voice low but deliberate. "It's the logical choice, defensive, predictable. So we'll do the opposite." Vale frowned. "You want us to move into open space?" Kale nodded. "We need to draw them out, away from the asteroid field. They'll think we're exposing ourselves, retreating in panic. But it's a feint." Vale's eyes narrowed as he followed Kale's movements on the map. "And when they pursue?" "We isolate their capital ships," Kale continued. "The Iron Bastion will lead the main fleet here." He gestured to a wide-open sector just beyond the asteroid field. "The Resolute Star and a flanking force will loop behind their formation. We strike their heavy ships first, cutting their firepower at the knees." Merrick chimed in, his tone skeptical but respectful. It's risky. If they spot the flanking maneuver. They won't, Kyle interrupted. Not if we use the asteroid field to mask our approach. The gravitational distortions will obscure our signatures long enough to get into position. Vale nodded slowly, the tension in his expression easing as the plan took shape. And the drones? Cale's lips curved into a faint smile. They'll play the bait. We'll deploy the majority of our drone units to simulate a disorganized retreat. The Zorthans will see exactly what they want to see. Chaos. The preparation began immediately, the bridge a flurry of controlled activity. Orders were issued with precision, every crew member moving with purpose as they executed Cale's strategy. The Resolute Star's drone bays buzzed with energy as rows of sleek AI-driven units were armed and launched into formation. Their small frames glinted faintly under the glow of the tactical lights, a deceptive display of fragility. Cale descended from the bridge to oversee the final adjustments in person. The ship's corridors were alive with the thrum of activity, engineers and technicians working tirelessly to ready the Resolute Star for the coming assault. Sparks flew from welding torches as armor plates were reinforced, and the air carried the distinct tang of hot steel and synthetic coolant. In the drone bay, Cale paused to observe the deployment process. Rows of drones lined the launch platforms, their compact frames humming with latent energy. A technician approached, wiping grease-streaked hands on his uniform. "Commander," the man began, his voice tinged with exhaustion but steady. "We've optimized the drone's programming for evasive maneuvers. They'll look panicked, but they'll hold the line." Kyle nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good work. Make sure they're ready to deploy on my signal." The technician saluted and returned to his station, leaving Cale to survey the bay. For a moment, the noise around him faded, replaced by a deep, steady focus. He could feel the weight of what was to come pressing against his chest, a pressure that sharpened his resolve rather than dulling it. Back on the bridge, the fleet began to move. The Iron Bastion led the charge, its massive frame carving through the asteroid field like a leviathan rising from the depths. Smaller support ships flanked it, their movements precise and coordinated. The Resolute Star held back, its engines running cool as it prepared to execute the flanking maneuver. Vale stood beside Cale, his expression a mixture of anticipation and concern. "The Zorthans will notice the drones soon." "That's the point," Cale replied. "We want them to believe they're chasing a retreating force. The longer they focus on the bait, the less they'll see us coming." As if on cue, the tactical display lit up with new movement. The Zorthan fleet was advancing, their formation tightening as they pursued the drones. Kyle watched their movements with a hunter's precision, noting the subtle shifts in their positioning. "They're committing," he said quietly. "Marek, begin the flanking approach. Keep us within the field's distortion until I give the order." The Resolute Star turned gracefully, its trajectory skirting the edge of the asteroid field. The gravitational anomalies tugged faintly at the ship's systems, but Marek's hands moved deftly across the controls, keeping the vessel steady. Outside the viewport, the asteroids loomed like silent sentinels, their jagged surfaces catching faint glimmers of starlight. "Zorthans are focusing fire on the drones," Vale reported. "They've taken the bait." Cale's gaze remained fixed on the display. "Good. Now let's make them regret it." The Iron Bastion engaged first, its railguns roaring to life as it tore into the nearest Zorthan capital ship. The enemy vessel's shields flared brilliantly, struggling to hold against the onslaught. Smaller Zorthan ships swarmed in response, their plasma turrets spitting streams of green energy that streaked through the void. Kyle waited, his focus unyielding. The Resolute Star and its flanking force were still concealed, their approach masked by the asteroid field. Every second brought them closer to the Zorthan's exposed flank, the tension coiling tighter with each passing moment. "Commander," Marek said, his voice sharp, "we're in position." Kyle's lips curved into a faint smile. "All units engage." The Resolute Star surged forward, its weapons blazing as it struck the Zorthan fleet from the side. The enemy vessels scrambled to respond, their formation fracturing under the sudden assault. The tactical display was alive with motion, the orderly lines of the Zorthon fleet dissolving into chaos. The Iron Bastion pressed its advantage, its EMP arrays disabling multiple Zorthon ships in quick succession. The smaller support vessels moved with lethal efficiency, targeting weakened ships and finishing them off with precision strikes. Kyle's voice rang out across the bridge. Focus fire on their remaining capital ships. Cut them off from the rest of the fleet. The Resolute Star's railguns roared again, their projectiles slamming into the nearest Zorthon capital ship. The vessel shuddered under the impact, its shields flickering before collapsing entirely. A final volley struck its engines, and the ship erupted in a blinding explosion that sent shockwaves rippling through the void. The Zorthon fleet was breaking. Kyle could see it in their movements, the hesitation, the lack of coordination. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment to turn the tide for good. The Zorthon fleet was crumbling. The fractured remnants of their once mighty armada were strewn across the void, their ships now little more than glowing wreckage drifting aimlessly. The silence on the bridge of the Resolute Star was deafening, broken only by the crisp exchanges of the crew as they worked to track the retreating enemy vessels. But this was no moment of celebration. Commander Darius Kyle stood at the center of it all, his body a statue of focus, his mind racing far ahead of the present. "They're consolidating," Vale said, his voice sharp and wary. "The remaining capital ships are falling back into a defensive wedge." Kyle studied the display, his expression unreadable. The tactical map glowed faintly, the positions of the surviving Zorthon ships tightening like a cornered beast baring its teeth. He could feel the desperation in their movements, but desperation was dangerous. A dying enemy had nothing to lose. "They know we won't chase them into deep space," Vale continued. "They're stalling." "They're not stalling," Kale said, his tone like a blade slicing through the air. "They're buying time." Vale blinked. "For what?" Kale didn't answer immediately. His mind churned, piecing together fragments of intelligence patterns in their tactics. Then the realization struck, sharp and cold. "They're preparing their superweapon," he said, his voice low but commanding. "That's their endgame. If they can't win conventionally, they'll use it." The crew froze, their collective breath caught in their throats. The Zorthon superweapon was no myth. It was a shadow that loomed over every engagement, a doomsday device capable of annihilating entire fleets in a single strike. It had only been used once before, and the devastation it had wrought was etched into galactic memory. Vale swallowed hard. "If they activate it, they won't get the chance," Kyle interrupted, his voice unyielding. "We end this now." The tension on the bridge was suffocating, but Kale thrived on it. He turned to Marek, his gaze as sharp as a predator's. "Bring us within range of their formation. I want all weapons ready to fire." Marek hesitated, then nodded. Understood. The Resolute Star surged forward, cutting through the void like a spear. The remaining ships of the Colossus fleet followed, their weapons glowing faintly as they prepared for the final engagement. On the tactical display, the Zorthon wedge began to shift, their movements precise and deliberate. They were preparing to make their stand. "They're forcing us into a kill zone," Vale muttered, his tone grim. "If we're wrong about their positioning—" "We're not wrong," Kale said, his voice like iron. "But they are. They think we're predictable, that we'll charge headfirst into their trap." He stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the display. "Marek, deploy the drones. Full swarm pattern. Make them think we're committing everything." The drones launched in waves, their sleek frames glinting faintly against the backdrop of space. They surged toward the Zorthon formation, weaving through the battlefield like a tide of silver. The enemy ships responded immediately, their plasma turrets swiveling to meet the threat. Streams of green energy streaked through the void, striking the drones with devastating precision. But for every drone destroyed, another two filled the gap, the swarm pressing relentlessly forward. "They're concentrating their fire on the drones," Vale reported, Their formation is holding, but their capital ships are exposed. Kyle's lips curled into a faint smile. Perfect. He turned to the weapons console. Merrick, target their flagship. I want everything we have focused on its main reactor. No margin for error. Marek nodded, his hands flying over the controls. The Resolute Star's railguns roared to life, their projectiles tearing through the void with unrelenting force. The first volley struck the Zorthan flagship's shields, which flared brightly before stabilizing. The second volley hit harder, and the shield began to flicker. They're redirecting power to the shields, Vale said. It's straining their weapon systems. Kale's gaze remained fixed. Keep firing. They can't hold forever. The Resolute Star surged closer, its weapons blazing as it closed the distance. The Zorthan flagship retaliated, its plasma turrets unleashing a hail of green fire. The energy slammed into the Resolute Star's shields, sending a shudder through the ship that rippled beneath the crew's feet. Shields at 40%, Vale warned. We can't take much more of this. Kale's voice was steady, unyielding. We don't need to. One more hit, and their shields will fail. The final volley struck true. The Zorthan flagship's shields collapsed in a burst of light, leaving its armored hull exposed. Kale didn't hesitate. Marek, target the reactor. Fire. The railguns fired again, their projectiles slamming into the flagship's hull with pinpoint accuracy. The first impact tore through its outer armor. The second breached its internal structure. The third hit the reactor directly. The explosion was cataclysmic. The flagship disintegrated in a blinding flash of light, the shockwave tearing through the surrounding ships and scattering debris across the void. The remaining Zorthan vessels faltered, their formation breaking as panic set in. Kale's voice rang out across the bridge. All units, press the attack. Show them no quarter. The Colossus fleet surged forward, their weapons blazing as they tore into the disorganized Zorthan fleet. One by one, the enemy ships fell, their hulls breaking apart under the relentless assault. The void was filled with the light of their destruction, a testament to humanity's defiance. As the last Zorthan ship detonated, the bridge fell silent. The tactical display showed only debris, the once mighty Zorthan fleet now reduced to ashes. Kyle stood at the center, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable. It's over, Vale said quietly. Kyle shook his head. This was just the beginning. He turned to the crew, his voice carrying the weight of his conviction. The galaxy has underestimated us for too long. They've dismissed us as primitives, as insects. But today we've shown them what humanity is capable of. We've proven that we belong among the stars, not as subjects, but as equals. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The crew stood in silence, their eyes fixed on their commander. For a moment there was no sound, no movement, only the unspoken understanding that they had just changed the course of history. Kyle turned back to the viewport where the wreckage of the Zorthan fleet drifted in the endless void. His gaze was unwavering, his expression one of quiet determination. Send a message to the United Galactic Council, he said. Tell them humanity stands ready. Tell them we will not be forgotten. As the Resolute Star and the Colossus fleet regrouped, the echoes of their victory carried across the void. It was not just a battle they had won. It was a declaration, a testament to humanity's strength, ingenuity, and resolve. And for the first time in centuries, the galaxy truly understood what it meant to face humanity. The silence in the void felt oppressive, broken only by the soft hiss of air filtration systems and the faint pulse of monitors on the bridge. The tactical display flickered with confirmation of the Zorthan fleet's annihilation, the once dominant predators of the galaxy reduced to drifting wreckage. The Resolute Star stood alone among the remnants, battered but undefeated, its hull bearing the scars of a battle that would redefine humanity's place in the cosmos. Commander Darius Kale's piercing gaze swept the bridge. The crew, exhausted but unwavering, awaited his next command. The gravity of their victory pressed down on them like the weight of a distant star, and yet, it wasn't over. Kyle's instincts told him so. The Zorthans had been too coordinated, too calculating in their final moments. Destruction alone wasn't their style. Vale stepped forward, his voice edged with concern. Darius, sensors are picking up residual energy signatures near the wreckage. It's faint, but it's not debris. Kyle interrupted, his voice a cold certainty. His eyes locked onto the display, scanning the scattered remains with an intensity that turned the bridge silent. They left something behind. Marek's fingers danced over his console, his face tightening with every readout. Sir, it's a power buildup. Large scale. This isn't just a weapon, they've rigged the wreckage. If it detonates, they mean to take us with them. Kale finished, his tone quiet but unyielding. He straightened, his presence a command in itself. Marek, isolate the core of that signature. Vale, run an analysis on its range. Vale's voice was clipped as he relayed the data. If it goes, it'll take the entire sector. That includes us, the fleet, and the forward colonies. The weight of the revelation pressed on the bridge like a tangible force, but Kale's expression didn't waver. He moved to the central console, tracing the trajectory of the energy buildup with swift precision. The Zorthans hadn't lost. This was their message. Even in death, they wanted to dominate, to remind the galaxy of their unmatched power. We're not letting them have that satisfaction, Kyle said, his voice a blade cutting through the rising tension. Marek, how long before detonation? 4 minutes, maybe less, Marek replied, his voice taut. Kyle's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he said nothing. His crew waited, their breaths caught in their chests, knowing the decision would come swiftly and without hesitation. When he spoke, his words were calm, measured. Prepare a launch trajectory. Target the central core of the buildup. We're going to overload it before it completes its cycle. Vale's eyes widened. Sir, the chain reaction could destroy the Resolute Star if we're too close. Kale finished, his gaze steady. I know. That's why I'm staying aboard. The room erupted in protest, voices clashing against each other in a symphony of defiance. But Kyle silenced them with a raised hand. His presence filled the space, his resolve a gravitational force that drew every eye. This isn't a debate, he said, his tone soft but immovable. The fleet needs to survive. Earth needs to survive. If the Zorthans think their endgame will make us retreat, they're wrong. Vale stepped forward, his face pale but determined. You're not doing this alone. If you think I'm abandoning you, you'll do what I need you to do. Kale cut in, his voice sharper now, commanding. Take the fleet and retreat to a safe distance. That's an order. Vale stared at him for a long moment, the weight of unspoken words heavy between them. Finally he nodded, his voice tight. Yes, sir. Kyle turned back to the tactical display, his mind already working through the calculations. Every second was a heartbeat closer to detonation. He didn't allow himself to think about the end, only the task at hand. Marek, adjust the railgun's trajectory, Kyle said, his focus absolute. We need to hit the core at exactly the right angle. Anything less and the reaction won't be contained. Yes, sir, Marek replied, his hands steady despite the tremor in his voice. The countdown ticked lower. Kale's fingers brushed the edge of the console, the cold metal grounding him. He glanced at the viewport where the scattered remains of the Zorthan fleet drifted like silent specters. The remnants of their arrogance, their belief in their own superiority. It wasn't destruction he saw. It was an opportunity. A message. Sir, the fleet is clear. Vale's voice came through the comms, subdued but resolute. We're holding at a safe distance. Kyle exhaled slowly, his breath fogging faintly in the cool air. Good. Take care of them, Vale. Make sure they know what we did here. The countdown hit the 2-minute mark. Kale's hands moved with precision, aligning the final trajectory. The Resolute Star's railguns groaned as they adjusted, their energy cores glowing faintly as they charged for one last strike. Marek, Kale said quietly. Fire. The railguns discharged with a force that reverberated through the ship, the projectiles streaking toward the core of the Zorthan device. Kale watched the tactical display, his heartbeat steady as the slugs tore through the void, piercing the remains of the Zorthan flagship. The first impact struck true. The energy signature wavered, destabilized. The second impact followed, and the buildup collapsed inward, its immense power folding on itself in a violent surge. The final explosion erupted, a brilliant sphere of light that consumed the wreckage in a silent storm. The resolute star trembled, the shockwave slamming into its hull. Alarms blared, the lights flickering as the ship's systems fought to hold. Kyle gripped the console, his gaze locked on the display. The energy surge dissipated, the chain reaction contained. It was over. Kyle straightened, his chest heaving with a deep, steadying breath. Around him, the bridge was quiet, the crew watching him with a mixture of awe and relief. He met their eyes, his expression softening. "Good work," he said simply. "Let's bring her home." The journey back to the fleet was slow, the Resolute Star battered but defiant. When they rejoined the Colossus fleet, cheers erupted across the comms, a wave of relief and celebration that echoed through every ship. Kyle allowed himself a small smile, but his focus remained steady. The war wasn't over. Not yet. As the fleet regrouped, Kyle addressed the United Galactic Council, his voice carrying the weight of what humanity had endured, and what it had proven. "The galaxy has underestimated us for too long," he said. "But today we've shown them who we are. We don't bow to fear. We don't crumble under pressure. We rise, we fight, and we endure. Humanity has earned its place among the stars, not through domination, but through unity and resolve." His words hung in the air, resonating through the void. For the first time, the galaxy truly understood what it meant to face humanity. They weren't just survivors. They were a force to be reckoned with. As the Resolute Star sailed into the void, scarred but victorious, Kale stood at the viewport, his gaze fixed on the stars. They weren't just humanity's future, they were a promise that they would never be underestimated again.